Welcome to the Geostrategic Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome. Thank you so much for watching or listening to the podcast today. Imagine a government that fears its own citizens more than foreign missiles. Right now, while the world focuses on rising tensions around Iran, something far more dangerous for the regime may be unfolding inside the country itself. Streets are filling with checkpoints. Patrols have tripled. Security forces have their fingers on the trigger. Why? Because Iran's leaders remember what happened during the last nationwide uprising, and they fear it could happen again. In this video, we'll reveal why protests terrify the regime more than bombs, why cities like Tehran are starting to resemble military zones, and why many believe the real battle for Iran is happening not at its borders, but in its streets. But before we dive in, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can understand what's really happening. And I want to hear from you. Do you think internal protests could change Iran's future? Or will the regime keep control? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and your perspective matters. Let's get into it.
Thanks for having me. This is a really crucial time to be looking at this.
It really is. So for our deep dive today, we are pulling from a lot of the latest updates. We've got recent intelligence statements, internal labor union communications, and even broadcasts directly from Iranian state media like IRNA.
Right, which gives us a pretty clear window into what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. We want to cut through the fog of international conflict and just look at the actual mechanisms of control being used right now. Because honestly, the contrast between the international headlines and the domestic reality is just stark.
It really is. I mean, if you look at the physical landscape of Iranian cities in the latest news, the primary target doesn't even look like an approaching foreign military.
Right.
The entire security apparatus is just overwhelmingly pointed inward at their own people.
Yeah, and the latest info paints a remarkably vivid picture of this. Major cities are effectively being transformed into fortified zones. Like, look at the March 13th update from IRNA. That's the state news agency. They reported that on the quote-unquote 14th day of the war, street patrols had basically tripled.
Tripled. That's a massive deployment of resources.
Right. And they're establishing these extensive checkpoints everywhere. But it's not just regular police manning them. It's plainclothes agents and besieged forces.
Which fundamentally alters the daily mechanics of living in a city like Tehran. I mean, you can't move from your home to a grocery store or just travel between neighborhoods without passing through this gauntlet.
It sounds incredibly tense.
It is. And, you know, the deployment of the besieged is a critical detail here. For those who might not know, the besieged are not your standard municipal police force.
Right. They're a paramilitary group, right?
Exactly. They are a volunteer militia operating directly under the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. So they are heavily ideologically driven.
And often operating in plain clothes, which has to make them incredibly unpredictable for the average. You literally don't know if the person standing next to you at a crosswalk is just a civilian or an armed state agent.
Which creates this constant underlying terror.
Yeah, and that actually lines up perfectly with a March 10th statement from the Coordinating Council of Iranian Teachers' Trade Associations. They described the atmosphere in Tehran as literally resembling a military barracks.
A military barracks. Wow. That really says it all.
Right. It's like you're looking at a pressure cooker, and the authorities have just decided to weld the safety valve completely shut instead of turning down the heat.
That's a really good way to put it.
But, I mean, when a government does this, when it triples its patrols against its own people during a foreign crisis, what does that signal about their actual priorities?
Well, it shows a deep-seated vulnerability. From a strategic standpoint, controlling the physical space of the streets is their immediate mechanism to prevent any form of public congregation.
It's just about keeping people apart.
Exactly. It is purely spatial mathematics. If state forces control the intersections, the public squares, the main roads, they prevent 10 people from gathering.
Right.
And if you stop 10 people, you prevent 100. You prevent 100 from becoming 10,000. They prioritize this spatial control over almost everything else.
Because they know that losing the physical streets is basically the precursor to losing the state itself.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Physical control isn't enough if the security forces hesitate to actually enforce that lockdown against their own neighbors.
Oh, right. Because these are still people from the same communities.
Exactly. And that takes us directly into the shifting rhetoric we're seeing from state officials. It's designed to provide a psychological workaround for that exact hesitation.
Okay, let's get into that. Because on March 10th, Ahmad Reza Radan, he's the commander of the state security forces, he went on state television with a very specific message.
Yeah, that broadcast was chilling.
It really was. He explicitly stated that anyone coming to the streets at the, quote, enemy's request is no longer viewed as a protester.
They are officially viewed as an enemy.
Exactly. And he added that his forces have their, quote, fingers on the trigger.
Right.
But wait, I'm struggling to understand the logic of this strategy. If you officially label everyday citizens as enemy combatants in the middle of a foreign conflict, aren't you essentially fighting a two-front war?
You are.
How can a state sustain that? I mean, doesn't it just completely demoralize your own military?
Well, it absolutely threatens unit cohesion. And that is exactly why the rhetoric has to be so absolute.
What do you mean?
Well, by legally and officially redefining domestic dissent as an act of war, the ruling establishment is trying to solve a severe moral and legal problem for its security forces.
Oh, okay, I see.
Think about it. If a citizen on the street is legally classified as a protester, there are generally accepted limitations on the use of force, even within heavily authoritarian systems.
Right, because there's an inherent psychological friction when a young conscript is ordered to point a rifle at someone who looks like their sister or their uncle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the moment you redefine that citizen as an enemy combatant, you shift the entire legal framework.
You neutralize that hesitation.
Precisely. Within their own legal and ideological framework, declaring someone an enemy combatant justifies extreme military action domestically.
It basically gives the forces on the ground a legal blank check.
Yeah, a blank check to operate on the streets of Tehran exactly as they would on a foreign battlefield.
Wow. But admitting that is a profound vulnerability, isn't it? It's the state acknowledging on national television that its primary adversary is the Iranian public.
It really is.
So why is the paranoia peaking right now? The recent updates point squarely at the ghosts of recent history, specifically the trauma the regime suffered during the December 2025 to January 2026 nationwide uprising.
Yeah, you really cannot separate the current military buildup from the memory of that winter uprising. That event is the lens through which the state views every single current threat.
And we see that explicitly in the latest info. The IRGC intelligence organization issued a statement on March 13th claiming that an evil enemy is exploiting wartime fears to reignite those exact street riots.
Right.
They even highlighted their belief that the winter street riots were actually a prelude to military strikes. Like they were openly linking domestic protests with foreign military invasion.
Because they view them as a single, unified threat vector. They remember how close they came to losing control during that winter uprising.
And now, with their attention divided by foreign tensions, they're terrified.
Exactly. They're terrified that the repressed anger of the public will resurface on an even larger scale. They know the public sees the state as distracted, and they fear people will use this moment to mobilize.
If you are listening to this and wondering how a government manages foreign policy when it is this terrified of its own people, the geostrategic implications are just staggering.
They really are.
It's like they were desperately negotiating a ceasefire to protect the castle walls, completely ignoring that the foundation inside is already crumbling.
That's a perfect analogy.
Can you clarify how this domestic illegitimacy actually complicates their foreign policy? Because recent updates say even if they secure a deal with foreign adversaries, it doesn't solve their domestic crisis.
Well, the regime cannot strike a compromise with a society that is actively demanding basic freedom and dignity. So this internal unrest entirely removes their geostrategic flexibility.
How so?
When a government lacks fundamental domestic legitimacy, national interest takes a backseat. Every single foreign policy decision, every negotiation is calculated primarily on internal survival.
Because their ultimate nightmare is their own people reclaiming the country.
Exactly. So their foreign policy is really just a shield to manage that internal threat.
So their foreign adversaries must see this, right? If you're negotiating with a government that is simultaneously deploying plainclothes militias in its own neighborhoods, you know their foundation is weak.
Oh, the international community is acutely aware of it. The Iranian state might project strength through missile displays or regional posturing, but foreign adversaries know that any compromise the regime makes externally could be perceived as weakness internally.
And perceived weakness sparks uprisings.
Right. They are trapped in a geopolitical corner of their own making.
To sustain this lockdown, they are pushing their rhetoric into incredibly dangerous territory. The latest info details some intense dehumanization tactics from the IRGC.
Yeah, this is where it gets really dark.
In recent statements, they've explicitly labeled participants of the protests as neo-ISIS.
Wow.
And the IRGC intelligence organization issued a direct threat warning the public that if new protests erupt, they will face a blow, quote, harder than January 8.
Which is significant.
Right. For context, January 8 was the single most brutal day of the January uprising. Security forces utilized lethal force on a massive scale, and thousands were killed.
And using a term like neo-ISIS is a highly calculated escalation. It's the tactical culmination of redefining a citizen as an enemy combatant.
Because ISIS is a universally recognized terror group.
Exactly. By applying that specific label to everyday citizens, the state is attempting to strip away any remaining empathy. They believe it gives them the moral authority to use their counterterrorism framework against their own people.
It signals that no rules of engagement apply.
Exactly.
But I have to ask, does this actually work? Using a term like neo-ISIS and threatening a massacre worse than January 8, does this level of threat actually deter people, or does it just confirm to the public that the government is completely detached from reality?
Well, it achieves both. And that duality is really the tragedy of this moment.
What do you mean?
In the immediate short term, the threat of overwhelming lethal force is highly effective as a deterrent. Reminding the public of a day where thousands were killed is designed to completely paralyze society with fear.
Right. It forces people to make a literal life or death calculation just to walk out their front door.
Yes, so the short-term suppression works. But in the long term, it is catastrophic for the state.
Because it validates the protesters' grievances.
Exactly. When a state publicly broadcasts, "We will treat you worse than a foreign terror group if you speak up," it provides undeniable proof that the social contract is completely severed.
The gap between the society and the regime has passed the point of no return.
Precisely. It proves that the true battlefield isn't on the borders, but in the neighborhoods of Iran.
It completely reframes how we should be interpreting the daily headlines. We're constantly fed news about foreign negotiations and border tensions, but the relationship between the state and the street level is the critical variable here.
When you synthesize all of these latest updates, a very fragile, highly combustible dynamic emerges. The checkpoints, the dehumanizing rhetoric, the threats of mass violence, these are the desperate actions of a system fighting for survival against its own population.
Which leaves us with a lot to think about as things unfold.
It really does. And I'd leave you all with this final question to ponder. If the Iranian regime is currently utilizing wartime conditions to justify treating its own citizens as enemy combatants, what happens to this volatile internal pressure once the external foreign conflict eventually de-escalates?
That is the defining question, because the checkpoints and the anger won't just vanish when the international headlines fade. Thank you, everyone, for listening or watching. We deeply appreciate your time and your curiosity. Please make sure you check out and listen to the other deep dives on our channel. Take care, and we'll see you next time.